Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here. Of course, I assume you know the first rule of life. If Leah Conradi tells you to do it, you do it. Leah is not just a dear friend. She's one of the best students I ever had, and one of the most extraordinary leaders I have seen emerging. Denver's loss is Region 1's gain. You should be blessed. Of course, your chairman, Mark Heckler, also has deep roots in Colorado, and your keynote speaker is from that state. So there must be some new kind of unity going on between the Mile High City and Region 1. I want to focus on what you are and what you're about in the context of where our nation is and where our nation is headed. I want to remind myself, though, before I launch into this, don't run for the exit. I have spent 25 years lecturing in 2-hour blocks. And I am now telling myself that if you think about the finest address in the history of our nation, a guy named Edward Everett from Massachusetts, a senator and a governor, was the keynote speaker on the battlefield at Gettysburg in 1863. He went on for 2 solid hours. Abraham Lincoln took less than 3 minutes. Which of those addresses can you quote? I'm no Abraham Lincoln, but I am not going to be an Everett either. I want us for a few minutes to begin to get back to basics. I want us to think, to reflect about first principles. It seems to me after a long life, a public life, a life engaged with issues and communities of this country, that at this difficult stage in our nation's history, we need to pause and reflect about who we are, where we came from, and where we're headed. An exercise that I think you would find meaningful would be to take some of the primary documents of our republic and just sit by yourself and read them and reflect on where our country is in the year 2017 and what it means to be a citizen of the United States of America. Jefferson, 240-some years ago, took on that task for us all when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. In it, he focused on one central notion, that just government rests upon the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed. We are a nation that functions at our best when we learn to have a consensual relationship. But think about how divided we are. Perhaps the only thing in some moments I feel we are consenting about is that we disagree. Not only do we seem to be agreeing to be disagreeable, but we seem also to not care. And I get discouraged. And then I come to a place like Northwest Indiana and see 800 of my fellow citizens who care enough to show up and relate to each other about what is good, not for their business, not for their political interest, but for their region, for where they live and where they structure their lives. You keep faith alive. I have participated in intense and sometimes divisive politics. The kind of politics of this room is what our country needs. One nation, one region. And it is important to have that as our focus. It is important because democracy itself is in jeopardy today. Democracy as a means of civil women and men shaping their own destiny is threatened. There are issues that divide us. There are issues having to do with taxation and environment and gun control and life and choice and health care. And those are important issues. But they are secondary to the question that should be in front of us. And that is, how goes it with our republic? Our failure to be able, by consent, to decide and resolve those questions is what is really at stake. We need to learn to be consenting adults, citizens. Jefferson believed that the highest compliment you could give another person was to call them a citizen. Think of what the first right is of being an American. It is not freedom of speech. It is not freedom of assembly. It is not freedom to choose and chart your own course with the lack of the interference of government. The first freedom is the freedom to govern yourself and to be a part of your governance. That's what this room looks like. That's why it's purposeful to be here. If we lose the first freedom, the freedom of self-governance, then all other treasured freedoms, from worship to speech to assembly, are in jeopardy. We remain free because together we can govern. A just government among men, wrote Jefferson, is a government that rests upon the consent of the governed. For a second, think about what consent is. It is not unanimity. This country has never been unanimous about anything. We can be intensely disagreeable and argumentative. But what has kept us alive for 241 years is that we finally come to agreement and move forward. That we consent, even if we don't 100% agree, we consent to move forward and decide not perfectly great issues, but to come up with solutions that, quote, we can live with. And that's what keeps us free. People talk about being principled politicians, principled business persons, principled members of the community. And that's a good thing. But when we framed our form of government, we made a list of those principles that would be given the highest respect, and that was called the Bill of Rights. And we put it to one side, and the Constitution then structured how we would do something different than principles, how we would do utilitarian governance. That is, governance that reach practical solutions, never perfectly honoring the principles, but perfectly honoring the fact that free men and women must work together to agree on solving their problems and moving forward. I don't know about you, but for me, marriage has never been a perfect institution. If nobody compromises, we'll see you at the courthouse and we'll give you a dissolution. Relationships work because people work together on them and they reach workable solutions. We as a country have got to come together to take again our governance back. We're split into factions, and factions may have worked for the Republic of the French, and factions may have worked for the Republic of Italy, but factions don't work in the end in this country. A fractured nation is not a nation that will long survive. A Scottish philosopher years ago wrote, I think, a very chilling thing about democracy. He wrote that democracies don't tend to last forever. 200 years seems about the length that they can go before they give out. We have just celebrated our 241st anniversary as a free people, the government of whom rests upon their consent. Can democracy last? That's up to one region. That's up to one state. That's up to one nation under God. It is an experiment that is always hanging in the balance. And we take it for granted. We think that if we can just get our way, that if we can just get, well, these days you don't even have to get a majority to govern. But majorities can be violent in nature. Voting can be a violent act. Government, wrote Jefferson, rests upon the consent of the government. Consent comes from a French and Latin word meaning to feel together, to have empathy for. And in that empathy for, we can live with the nature of the decisions we make. If you want simply to have your way, there is a solution tried through history. Get yourself a dictator. Choose an emperor. Bring on a king or a queen and give them great power and force, and your solution to all problems will be implemented by force. But if you want a nation where its citizens feel the government belongs to them and that has learned to take responsibility for its decisions, you better hope this democracy lasts. Democracies are fragile. That's their very nature. And ours is at a place in time where what you represent in this room and what you do together is priceless, is critical, is absolutely necessary. Looking to the common interest of your region, taking responsibility for imperfect actions and decisions, but moving together under law, caring about where things go and how they turn out, not insisting simply on your own way, but helping your community find its way. We are at a fragile time. It will take enormous efforts of citizenship, of showing up, of being accountable, of being present, of being there. And listen again to Jefferson's words when he wrote to a friend in Virginia at a very difficult time in 1804 for our country when he was president. And he said, I tell you, democracy will survive only if it can maintain freedom through truth and rationality. Freedom through truth and rationality. We talk about fake news today. Truth is essential to citizens deciding things together. There's not your truth and Bowie's truth and Leah's truth and Fred's truth. Truth is singular. We never know it perfectly, but it's singular. And the quest for truth, both in science and in politics, is an important quest. The role of the press in this country is one of the most important institutions ever conceived by the mind of men and women. My first job was writing obits for my hometown newspaper. I didn't write very good obits. You wouldn't have wanted to die while I was writing obits. But I watched what happened in, quote, a newsroom where legitimate, caring men and women tried to get across to our little community what was happening and what was going on. And telling the truth required bravery. The Klan burned a cross in our yard because my father, the district attorney, put a bunch of the good old boys in jail. The newspaper reported the story. And when they got out of jail, one of the members of the Klan beat up the city editor for just printing the truth. Truth is essential to self-governance and keeping institutions alive that provide us that context, so important. And then Jefferson said, rationality. I don't know whether we're rational creatures or not. Some days I despair. I helped raise 7 teenagers. I've applied for the Congressional Medal, but I have not received it. I have noticed that teenagers do not appear to be rational beings all the time, not even much of the time sometimes. But I now have 5 sons and 2 daughters who are amazing adults. And like you with your children, I take great pride in that outcome. Our country needs to get over being adolescent. Our country needs to grow up and use its prefrontal cortex to think, to be rational, and to engage with fellow citizens with respect for their opinion, with empathy, but always using our abilities to think. I've taught in a school of higher education for almost a quarter of a century. I guess I have a skewed view of human nature in that sense, but I have found that we are at our best somehow when we use our brains I have a nice little dog named Wolf. Wolf can pronounce his own name. Don't laugh at Wolf. But Wolf doesn't have a prefrontal cortex worth a damn. I have worked with him on this. He's 11 now, and I'm 80, and we aren't going to reach any conclusion, it appears. I love him nonetheless. But the importance of using what God has given us to rule ourselves is so important. Ben Franklin had a sense of humor, and he could sometimes be a little cynical. He said, oh yeah, democracy. That's like two wolves and a lamb deciding what they're going to have for lunch. And that sometimes has been how our democracy is. But it need not be. People can have lunch together, have the kind of honest, open conversations you're having, show deference and respect to each other, hold things that you mutually care about above those things that you individually disagree about. It's possible, and you're doing it here, and that is exciting. I grew up in North Carolina. I know my accent doesn't show that. I've lived over 45 years in Colorado. But if you would allow me this privilege, I want to close by reading the words of Thomas Wolfe in his novel, You Can't Go Home Again. Look Homeward, Angel, which was published after his death. And this is the 48th chapter. It's called Credo. And it sums up where my head is today and where I feel like maybe we as a people are going. These are Thomas Wolfe's words. I believe that we're lost here in America, but I believe we shall be found. And this belief, which mounts now to the catharsis of knowledge and conviction, is for me, and I think for all of us, not only our own hope, but America's everlasting living dream. I think the life which we have fashioned in America, and which has fashioned us, the forms we made, the cells that grew, the honeycomb that was created, was self-destructive in its nature and must be destroyed. I think these forms are dying and must die, just as I know that America and the people in it are deathless, undiscovered, and immortal, and must live. I think the true discovery of America is before us. I think the true fulfillment of our spirit, of our people, of our mighty and immortal land is yet to come. I think the true discovery of our own democracy is still before us. And I think that all these things are as certain as the morning, as inevitable as noon. I think I speak for most men and women living when I say that our America is here, is now, and beckons on before us. And this glorious assurance is not only our living hope, but our dream to be accomplished. You are our dream to be accomplished, and I am honored to be here. Thank you.